It looks like, without Steve Atkinson here, the ball was dropped on getting people to lead in worship. You just jumped up and volunteered, didn't you, Mark? Yeah. Jared, would you take care of communion since you did it this morning? I hate to put you on the spot, but you got a little bit of experience. Josh, would you lead our closing prayer? This series of studies I'm doing on the second Sunday night of the month is more academic, it's more intellectual. It's not the type of lesson that I did, for example, this morning. It's really geared towards college students, so it'll be on our website so that they can go back and watch it at some point. It's the type of questions that we hear at work. Well, I don't hear it at work. Donna doesn't ask me if Christianity promotes violence, but you might hear it at work. Somebody challenging Christianity. The idea that we all would just be better off if we didn't have religion, Christianity or any other religion. And that's what we're going to look at tonight, is those types of criticisms that this second Sunday night of the month series is dealing with. Bertrand Russell was a British philosopher and thinker who is most well known for writing the book Why I Am Not a Christian. Between World War I and World War II, he made this claim: religion prevents us from removing the fundamental causes of war. Religion prevents us from teaching the ethic of scientific cooperation in place of old, fierce doctrines of sin and punishment. It is possible that mankind is on the threshold of a golden age, but if so, it will first be necessary to slay the dragon that guards the door, and that dragon is religion. Now, it is true that people from every religion have perpetrated violence and sought support for that violence in their respective sources of authority. For example, the criticism against Christianity is the Crusades. Now, first of all, we ask, what did Jesus teach? Now, I've pointed out in at least one of these lessons before that when we are talking about these criticisms against Christianity, oftentimes we're not talking about New Testament Christianity. We're not talking about God's definition of Christianity. A lot of times we have to distinguish between what people understand about what Christianity is, or their perception of Christianity, and what the Bible actually teaches. And this is one of those occasions. Because Jesus rejected violence, didn't he? Matthew chapter 5 and verse 39. If anyone slaps you on one cheek, you turn to him the other also. When these same disciples tried to resist his arrest with swords, Jesus rebuked them in Luke chapter 22 rather. And then he healed the ear of one of those that came out to arrest him. Jesus' commandment to his disciples is, you love your enemies. And you bless those who persecute you. And you pray for those who malign you. In Matthew 5 and verse 44. And so Jesus' teachings and Jesus' behavior flipped the script on human nature. When it seems like our nature is to strike back, Jesus said, don't do it. And so Jesus' words were put into action. When the soldiers were nailing Jesus to the cross, and he prayed for their very forgiveness. Luke 23 and verse 34. And the first followers of Jesus continued that pattern of non-violence as they were being persecuted through the book of Acts, and even dying for the sake of their faith. But does that teaching square with the last 2,000 years of church history? Even in our country within recent years, I don't want you to read that yet. There's been crusading language that has been used on both sides of the divide after 9/11. For example, President George W. Bush said this crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while. I'm not saying President Bush intended that to be taken in any kind of religious sense. Maybe he did. I don't know. But the perception is that he was using it in a religious sense, at least by many people. Osama bin Laden wrote, "We hope that these brothers will be the first martyrs," this is following 9/11, "in the battle of Islam in this era against the new Jewish and Christian crusader campaign that is led by the chief crusader, Bush, under the banner of the cross." You see how Osama bin Laden interpreted Bush's actions, if not words, in the context of crusade. So what did the medieval crusades have to do with the present conflict? This is a historian, Robert Wilkin, who wrote that the Crusades were a Christian counteroffensive against the occupation of lands that had been Christian for centuries before the arrival of Islam. Jerusalem was first taken over by the Muslims in 637 AD. And that launched the first crusade to get Jerusalem back. That first crusade had it as its aim to take Jerusalem back for Christians and for Jews. During that first crusade, tens of thousands of Muslims were killed, including women and children. Now we have to understand that the desire to retake Jerusalem in its historical context and the centuries of conquest by Muslim armies that the Christians, in the broad definition, sustained during that time, and the needless slaughter of women and children represented to non-Christian world a stunning failure of what many people viewed as Christian ethics. But Jesus did not give Jerusalem into the hands of Christians, did he? You see, this is a clear example of misunderstood or misapplied theology. Once Jesus came into the world, the city of Jerusalem has no more importance at all. It doesn't matter who dwells in Jerusalem today, not one bit. It does not matter. There is no permanent importance for the city of Jerusalem in God's overall plan. And that's where misapplied theology causes problems. Many of the so-called Christian world believe that Jerusalem has to be under the leadership of Christians so that Jesus can come back to earth and rebuild his temple, the one described in the prophet Ezekiel, and then reign for 1,000 years. That's the origin of this idea that Jews and Christians have to control Jerusalem. And that's just false theology. The New Testament speaks often against violence, as we've already pointed out, and certainly the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians. So it's a tragic reality of Christian history that people have perpetrated these things in the name of Christ, which Jesus would not have condoned. In fact, he taught against it. It's a tragic reality of Christian history. Despite the biblical bonds of brotherhood across differences, despite Jesus' commands to his followers, to his disciples, to love their enemies, despite Jesus' own reputation for loving his enemies and forgiving his enemies and teaching against violence and the way Christians accepted martyrdom in the early years of Christianity, the last 2,000 years have seen a lot of people perpetrate violence. Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against other Protestants, in the name of Christ. And none of that is biblical. None of it is biblical. But the perception is there. And this is an occasion where we as Christians who take the New Testament perhaps more seriously than others do, have to simply point out that that behavior is not acceptable to Christ. We don't have to defend that behavior. In fact, we should criticize that behavior if it does not rise to the level of Christian teaching. the teaching of Jesus Christ. All right, well, what about Buddhism? You see, many people see Buddhism as an outlier in the global religious scene. Islam and Christianity, they're both violent religions. People have perpetrated violence in the name of these two religions, conjures up visions of jihads and crusades. Buddhism is just meditation. But if you know the history of Buddhism, you'd be just as appalled by the violence that has been propagated. For example, just one example, the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. Maybe you've never heard of it. Doctors Without Borders have estimated that 9,000 Rohingya, including 1,000 children, died after these attacks by Buddhists against Muslims. Look at the title of this article from the New York Times. Why are we surprised when Buddhists are violent? The author reminds us that there is no shortage of historical examples of violence within Buddhist societies. He cites Sri Lanka's Civil War. I did a research paper on the Churches of Christ in Sri Lanka back in graduate school. Wars, Buddhist against Muslims and against Christians in Sri Lanka. It was fueled by Buddhist nationalism. Violence in modern Thailand, Buddhist against other religions, violence within the Dalai Lama's own sect, and a growing body of literature on Buddhist institutions in World War II against other religions that have their origin in Japan. My point is not that Buddhism is particularly violent. Millions of Buddhists do live peaceful lives. I hope you understand the point is Buddhism is not necessarily a religion of peace. Those who think that Buddhism is inherently a religion of peace are deceiving themselves and they're closing their eyes to reality. 2016, Martin Scorsese had this movie, brought this movie out called Silence, which draws attention to another counterintuitive reality about religions in the Far East. Because Americans like to romanticize Eastern religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, these other religions, that they're peaceful. Silence gave voice to the persecution of Christians of European origin and Japanese who claimed to be Christians at the hands of Shinto Buddhist government in the 17th century Japan. Tens of thousands of Christians were executed in ways that are so atrocious and vulgar that eyewitnesses had a hard time describing them. And of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict going on today suggests that there is no religion that has been free from violence. So was Bertrand Russell right? Can we safely conclude that slaying the dragon of religion is going to usher in an age of peace? When we take Christianity out of the picture, what do we have left? Well, how about communism? Jesus championed the rights of the poor, right? He championed respect for the oppressed. He claimed to have come to proclaim good news to the poor. That's Luke chapter 4 and verse 18. The first Christians took very seriously Jesus' commands to help the poor. In Acts chapter 4, goods were held in common. They had members of their own congregation that were in need, and so they even sold land in order to have the money to give, to distribute to those who were in need. By the 4th century, as I've mentioned in sermons before, Christians were establishing hospitals to care for the sick and the needy, welfare systems. Karl Marx, the father of socialism, saw how far supposedly Christian Europe had fallen short of the biblical promise to take care of the poor. And he concluded that Christianity was not a key to the release of the poor, but a drug to tranquilize them. Religion, he wrote, is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. He said, religion is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand of their real happiness. In other words, Karl Marx saw the religious clergy in Europe taking advantage of the poor. And the poor found solace in this freedom from their plight in these ritualistic acts that they would go through what we would call worship. 61 million people were killed in the former Soviet Union under communism. 35 million slaughtered in the People's Republic of China. Not to mention human rights abuses perpetrated by other smaller communist states, including Romania, North Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam, Cuba. R.J. Rummel said of all religions, secular and otherwise, that of Marxism has been by far the bloodiest. Marxism has meant bloody terrorism, deathly purges, lethal prison camps, and murderous labor, fatal deportations, man-made famines, extrajudicial executions, and fraudulent show trials, outright mass murder, and genocide. Marxism is not going to be the answer to having a peace in the world. Some people have associated Hitler with Christianity. Of course, think about the Holocaust. The genocide emanated from a country that had been majority Christian, Lutheran, for centuries. If the evils of communism are a blot on atheism, are the evils of Nazism a blot on Christianity? Claiming to guard Germany from the atheistic communism, Hitler invoked God in his earliest speeches. And in his book he wrote, translated My Struggle, Mein Kampf, he said, I believe today that my conduct is in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. You see, he sought support in the Bible's religion for what he was doing, for his anti-Semitism. In 1933, shortly after assuming power, he oversaw the signing of a concordat between the Vatican and the German Reich that protected church freedoms, ostensibly, and their interest from what Hitler was going to be doing. Hitler wanted to harness the religion of the Catholic Church, Lutheran Church, for his own ends. But for all the ways in which Christians failed to oppose Hitler's rise to power, the religion that he harnessed, of course, was not Christianity. It was not even Christianity by the definition of the world. Baldur von Schrock, that quotation there, he was the head of the Hitler Youth Movement. He said the destruction of Christianity was explicitly recognized as a purpose of the National Socialist movement, the Nazi Party. Now, many leaders in the National Church of Germany defended Adolf Hitler. See, that's the reason why in many people's minds, Christianity and Nazism went hand in hand. Because a lot of church leaders supported and defended Hitler. Why? Because of their own anti-Semitism. The Nazis endorsed what they call positive Christianity, but they changed the Bible to fit their own ends. For example, Jesus was rebranded as an Aryan, a German, or a member of the race that produced the Germans, would be a better way to define it. Nazi-era Bibles removed the Old Testament and edited the Gospel to purge references to Jesus' Jewishness. and the statements that he made where he prioritized his mission to the nation of Israel, the lost sheep of the tribe of Israel, house of Israel, those were purged. His fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures were purged, which means he had to cut gaps out of the Gospel of Matthew on just about every page. They edited New Testament texts in other ways to align with their ideology. For example, the Sermon on the Mount was purged of its deep compassion for the weak and made to sound militaristic. Look at this prayer that the Nazi youth were taught to pray and compare it to how it sounds to the Lord's Prayer. Adolf Hitler, you are our great Fuhrer. Thy name makes the enemy tremble. Thy Third Reich comes. Thy will alone is law upon the earth. Let us hear daily thy voice and order us by thy leadership, for we will obey to the end, and even with our lives we praise thee. Hail Hitler. Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation movement, stoked anti-Semitism because he was disappointed in the Protestant Reformation's efforts to convert Jews en masse to Jesus Christ. So that mentality among Germans, like Lutherans, who claimed to be Christian, made the victimization of Jews easier under Hitler. Hitler came to power 3 years after Bertrand Russell made that statement that I started the lesson with. He declared that religion prevents us from teaching the ethic of scientific cooperation and placed the old fierce doctrines of sin and punishment. That was the statement by Bertrand Russell. If Hitler spawned a new religion to support his racist ideology, he also sought to justify it by science. Is science what's going to bring us a new peace, an era of peace? If nature does not wish weaker individuals to mate with stronger individuals, then nature weeds them out. That's the theory of evolution. And Hitler believed that. Hitler believed that the Aryan race, the German race of people, was superior to the Jews in particular and others. He didn't just persecute Jews, he persecuted the gypsies and others. So he thought it was justified to exterminate them. He was making a stronger human race. And he based that on his understanding of evolution, the descent of man, specifically by Charles Darwin. And he argued based on that. Again, in Hitler's view, the Aryan race was superior, and to maintain racial purity was an evolutionary ethic that he tried to follow. If nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with a stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such a case all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. Incidentally, there have been people in our own country who have been racist, who have used that same argument against blacks or against interracial marriages, because in their view blacks were an inferior race. But the only justification they could have for that is evolutionary, which of course is not justification for it. But there's no Bible to justify such a mentality. Hitler believed the stronger must dominate and not mate with the weaker, which would signify the sacrifice of its own higher nature. Only the born weakling can look upon this principle as cruel, and if he does so, it is merely because he is of a feebler nature and narrower mind. For if such a law did not direct the process of evolution, then the higher development of organic life would not be conceivable at all. It's the desire to create a superior race and using evolution to justify what he has done. One of Hitler's strongest intellectual influences was the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche believed that God had been declared functionally dead. He believed that the rationalistic thoughts that came out of the Enlightenment had simply made God unnecessary. Or in his words, God is dead. In the book Twilight of the Gods, he wrote, when one gives up the Christian faith, notice his statement, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. By breaking one main concept out of Christianity, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessary remains in one's hands. Now, on that statement, Nietzsche is correct. There is no ethics if you take God out of the picture. There is no foundation for morality if you take Jesus out of the picture. Well, that's why people don't want God in the picture, because they know that God inherently limits behavior. That was the philosopher that influenced Adolf Hitler. Okay, so we've ruled out all of those as sources of peace in our world today. What about democracy? That's the answer to everything, isn't it? Liberal democracy. Let us all vote on it. It has been correlated to a range of goods. Pinker remarks that democracies have higher rates of growth, their societies, their economies, fewer wars and genocides. Haven't you heard the statement that we don't wage war in a country where there's a McDonald's? It's because of this freedom that democracy and the free enterprise brings. There are fewer genocides, healthier and better educated citizens, virtually no famines in countries that are free, that are democracies. In fact, I just saw a headline yesterday, day before yesterday, about why the vaccines were not getting to the common people in the country of India. I didn't read the article, but my guess is because the people higher up are looking for handouts. That's the way countries like that work. If there's no freedom, the people at the top have to get money before they give medicine to the people at the bottom. That's just how it works. That's how totalitarian governments work. To us today, in the United States, democracy seems to be just a self-evident good, as native to the modern way of thinking as science is. But there's two problems with that. First of all, people forget Christianity's relationship with the growth and spread of democracy. Remember, I had a whole series of lessons all year long a few years ago about how the Bible created the Western, the American mindset in so many ways. Democracy is one of them. Translating God's Word into the common people's language unleashed a flood of people believing that you could think for yourself. It was the translation of the Bible that opened that floodgate and motivated people to believe that they could govern themselves based on God's Word. The road has neither been straight nor smooth, the relationship between Christianity and democracy. Christians have both helped to cultivate democratic ideas of equality, but also perpetuated repressive ideas of statism and elitism. We don't need to romanticize a past that can be complex, but there's a biblical ethic that teaches that humans are equal regardless of their status. And there's an insistence that leaders need to be servants, that we need to treat other people the way we want them to treat us, that we all have flaws, a realistic idea of human nature. But yet Christianity, along with democracy, has helped enable countries to build themselves up and to bring freedom to their people. Now, the link between Christianity and democracy is even evident outside of the United States. Robert Woodbury is a political scientist, and he wrote that the historic prevalence of Protestant missionaries explains half of the existence of democracies in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Oceania, and removes the impact of most variables that dominate current statistical research. In other words, missionaries have been catalysts to initiate the development and the spread of religious liberty, mass education, freedom and respect for women, the mass printing of newspapers, allowing people to have the right to share their own views, forming their own voluntary organizations. You see, those are points that you and I take for granted because they're embedded in our Constitution, which incidentally is being eroded day after day. But we take those freedoms for granted, but in other countries, even today, they're just now getting taste for those freedoms. And they were introduced by those freedoms by, according to this political scientist, through missionaries who have been taking them Christianity and the freedom to govern themselves. The second factor that suggests democracy is a source for peace. Second factor that Americans forget is that when we perceive liberal democracy as the natural form of government, we have to ignore the questionable compatibility that democracy has with the other major world religion. And that, of course, is Islam. Sharia law, there's the quote from Woodbury. Sharia law is not just the Quran. Sharia law includes the Quran and oral history that can't be traced back to the Quran. And it can't be defended necessarily as being out of Muhammad's mouth. Muslim scholars debate those kind of things. But Sharia law prescribes a political structure and a set of laws that oftentimes is just not possible to wed with democracy. And in fact, in 2017, only 6 of the 57 member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation were considered to be democracies. 6 out of 57. In countries where leaders implement Sharia law, it's just hard to establish liberal democracy. Democracy doesn't just happen. We have come through a very contentious political season. So far, our country hasn't split apart. But democracies are hard. It's hard to see somebody else get voted into office when you voted against them. It's hard to see laws implemented by a majority vote in Congress when you didn't agree with the law. That's hard. Democracies don't come easily. They have to be based on the right philosophical foundations. Why haven't we launched into civil war because we don't like who got elected to the White House? Why haven't we split the country? Because there's still enough fundamental Christian principles in our society to say, okay, the majority voted against me, therefore I have to accept it. We are a country ruled by law. Why don't we launch into civil war because we don't like the fact that the Supreme Court ruled that homosexual marriages are legal? Why haven't we split the country over that? Because we believe that law rules. And we believe that our ultimate source of adjudication in our country is the Supreme Court. Once the Supreme Court rules, as far as our civil society is concerned, that settles the matter. Why? Because as a society we recognize that we're under law. The foundation for that is Christian principles. The deeper problem, the problem diagnosed by Karl Marx, the failure of Christians to deliver on the New Testament promise of peace. Why did the Crusaders indulge in unnecessary slaughter? Why did so many German churches support Adolf Hitler? Why did a significant number, if not the majority of Americans, at least in the South, embrace slavery? First of all, we cannot assume that everyone who identifies as a Christian is actually a Christian. You and I know as New Testament Christians, there's a huge gap between what the world defines as a Christian and what the New Testament defines as a Christian. And I think that's a big source of this criticism. Secondly, the Bible teaches us to expect moral failures from Christians. When was the last time you lost your temper? Christians don't always live up to our own expectations, do we? At the heart of Christianity is a symbol of extreme violence. The brutal, torturous, state-sponsored execution of an innocent man. At the cross, the most powerful man who ever lived submitted to the most brutal death ever died to save those who don't have the power to save themselves. Christianity does not glorify violence. Christianity humiliates violence. Our most fundamental problem as Americans, as human beings, is not a lack of education. It's not democracy. It's not opportunity. It's the cruel reality that the Bible defines as sin. That's man's problem. The strange claim of Jesus' resurrection is that it offers us hope that evil is not going to ultimately triumph. That anyone who gives up his or her life to follow Christ is going to save it. New York Times op-ed by Nicholas Kristof, who is no friend of Christians. The title is Evangelicals Without the Blowhards. Listen to his statement or read his quote. Go to the front lines, at home or abroad, in the battles against hunger, malaria, prison rape, obstetric fistula, human trafficking, or genocide, and some of the bravest people you meet are evangelical Christians or conservative Catholics, he says, similar in many ways, who truly live their faith. Family, as our society becomes more and more anti-Christian, the challenge for me and you is getting stronger and stronger for us to live New Testament Christianity. And we've got to show people what Christianity really is. Not what they see on TV, not what they hear in the movies or wherever else. Does religion cause violence? It certainly can. But millions of people are driven by their faith, like you, to love and to serve others. Christianity, in particular, has served as a fertilizer for democracy, a motivation for justice, and a mandate for healing. The Me Too movement has come along asking for women to be treated with respect and honor and dignity. Well, welcome to Christianity. The Black Lives Matter movement, at least part of it, is asking for equality and respect for blacks. Well, welcome to Christianity. We've been preaching and teaching. If we've been following the Bible, we've been preaching and teaching that ever since. Our left is finally just catching up to where Christianity has always been. The world's going to get worse. And that's why it's important for us to stay the course, to stick with New Testament Christianity and continue teaching it and living it. Because one day the world's going to come back around and say, you know what? You were teaching and practicing the truth all along. Well, thank you very much, because we follow Christ. If we think the world would be less violent without Christianity, we need to check our facts. And next month, we'll answer the question, how can you take the Bible literally? We want to extend the invitation of Christ to you tonight. If there's anything we can do for you, prayer or encouragement to help you in your relationship with Christ, let us know. Let's stand and sing.